Gas stations are places we barely think about, just a pit stop for gas, snacks, or directions. But what if that stop became the last place you'd ever feel safe? Tonight, I'm sharing 5 stories of gas stations where ordinary turned terrifying, and routine became something far more sinister. Grab a seat, turn off the lights, and let's take this dark ride together. It was just after midnight when Mike realized he was low on gas. He'd been driving for hours, making his way back to the city after visiting an old friend in the mountains. The highway was pitch black, his headlights the only thing cutting through the darkness. When the low fuel light blinked on, Mike cursed under his breath. He hadn't seen a sign for a station in miles. He lowered the radio, hoping to focus on the road ahead, when his GPS suddenly chirped to life. Next gas station, 2 miles ahead. Relieved, Mike followed the directions. Sure enough, just off the highway, a dimly lit gas station appeared. Its neon sign buzzed faintly, spelling out "Last Stop" in flickering letters. Mike pulled in, his tires crunching on the gravel. The station was old, 2 pumps, a rundown convenience store, and a single street lamp casting a weak glow over the lot. As he stepped out of the car, the air felt heavier, like a storm was coming. He grabbed the pump, inserted his card, and waited for the familiar beep. It didn't come. Instead, the screen displayed an error message. "See attendant." Mike groaned and glanced toward the store. The windows were dark, but the open sign buzzed faintly in the window. Reluctantly, he walked inside. The store was eerily quiet. Rows of outdated snacks and dusty magazines lined the shelves. Behind the counter stood an older man with grey hair and a weathered face. His eyes, though, were sharp, too sharp. "Pump's not working," Mike said. The attendant didn't respond right away. He just stared, as if sizing Mike up. Then he nodded slowly and muttered, "Which pump?" "Pump 2, Mike replied. The man's expression didn't change, but something about the way he nodded again made Mike uneasy. Without another word, the man pressed a button on the register and waved Mike off. As Mike turned to leave, the man said, almost as an afterthought, "Don't stay too long." Mike froze, half turning back. What does that mean? But the man didn't answer. He just stared, his sharp eyes following Mike as he left the store. Back at the pump, Mike tried again. This time, it worked. As the tank filled, he scanned the empty lot. The silence was oppressive, the hum of the pump the only sound. That's when he noticed it, a figure standing at the edge of the street lamp's light. Mike squinted, trying to make it out. It was a woman wearing a long dress that fluttered in the breeze. She wasn't moving, just standing there, facing him. "Hey!" Mike called out. "You okay?" No response. The pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. Mike quickly replaced the nozzle and glanced back toward the figure, but she was gone. His heart pounded as he climbed into his car, locking the doors out of instinct. He started the engine and pulled out of the lot, his eyes darting to the mirrors. That's when he saw her again. She was standing in the middle of the road, directly in his path. Mike slammed on the brakes, his tires screeching to a halt. The woman didn't move. She just stood there, her face still hidden in shadow. "Get out of the way," he shouted, his voice shaking. But she didn't budge. Mike's hand hovered over the gear shift. Should he back up? Drive around her? Before he could decide, the figure vanished, gone, as if she had never been there. His breathing was ragged as he sat frozen in the driver's seat. Then his phone buzzed on the dashboard, jolting him back to reality. The screen lit up with a notification. "Turn back." Mike's stomach dropped. His phone wasn't even connected to the GPS anymore. Suddenly, the car stalled. The engine sputtered and died, leaving him in complete darkness. Desperate, Mike tried to restart it, but the ignition only clicked uselessly. Then he heard it, a soft tapping on the driver's side window. Slowly, he turned his head. The woman was there, her face inches from the glass. Her eyes were hollow, black pits, and her mouth stretched into a jagged, unnatural smile. Mike screamed, fumbling with the door lock, but it was no use. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it was pounding, echoing in his ears. And then, silence. When Mike opened his eyes, he was sitting in his car, parked back at the gas station. The tank was empty, the pump handle dangling loosely by his car. He glanced toward the store, but it was dark. The attendant was gone. Mike didn't wait to question it. He started the car, this time it roared to life, and sped off, vowing never to stop at another gas station again. But later that night, as he pulled into his apartment complex, he froze. In the rearview mirror, he saw her, sitting in his back seat. Pause. What would you have done in Mike's situation? Driven off? Or tried to help the woman? Let me know in the comments. Chris had been on the road for 6 hours, heading home after a work trip in another state. The highway stretched endlessly ahead of him, a ribbon of asphalt swallowed by darkness. His dashboard beeped. Low fuel. He groaned and checked his GPS, which showed the next gas station 10 miles away. By the time he reached it, his car was running on fumes. The station was small, isolated, and oddly quiet. A single fluorescent light flickered over the pumps, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Chris pulled up to the closest pump and stepped out. The air was heavy, and the only sound was the faint buzz of the flickering light. He swiped his card. Error. See attendant. Chris sighed and glanced toward the convenience store. Its windows were dark, but the open sign buzzed faintly in the corner. Reluctantly, he headed inside. The store smelled of stale air and cleaning supplies. Rows of old snacks and faded postcards lined the shelves. Behind the counter stood a man in his late 40s, wearing a grease-stained uniform. His face was tired, but his eyes were sharp, almost too alert. "Pump's not working," Chris said, holding up his card. The attendant didn't respond right away. He just stared at Chris, then slowly nodded. "Which pump?" the man finally asked, his voice gravelly. Pump 1. The attendant punched something into the register without breaking eye contact. Then he said, almost in a whisper, "You should hurry." Chris frowned. What's that supposed to mean? But the man didn't answer. Instead, he turned and disappeared through a door behind the counter, leaving Chris standing there alone. Uneasy, Chris returned to his car. As he pumped gas, he scanned the lot. That's when he saw it. Someone standing at the far end of the station, just outside the glow of the lights. The figure was barely visible, shrouded in shadow, but it was clear they were watching him. "Hey!" Chris called out, his voice echoing across the lot. "You need something?" No response. The pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. Chris replaced the nozzle, keeping his eyes on the figure, but as he climbed into his car and started the engine, the figure moved. Not toward him, not away, just closer. It was impossible to tell how. One moment they were at the edge of the lot, the next they were halfway to his car, still standing, still watching. Chris's heart pounded as he threw the car into reverse. He didn't bother looking back. All he could focus on was getting out of there. He sped out of the lot, his tires kicking up gravel, and merged back onto the highway. For a few miles, Chris kept glancing in his rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure again. But the road was empty. He let out a shaky breath, gripping the wheel tighter. Then his headlights caught something up ahead. A car, parked on the shoulder. As Chris passed it, his blood ran cold. It was his car, the same make, the same model, the same license plate. Chris slammed on the brakes, his chest heaving. He stared in disbelief at the identical car in his rearview mirror, now perfectly parked on the side of the road. He didn't understand. He couldn't. And then he felt it, a presence in the car. Slowly, he turned his head toward the passenger seat. Sitting there, staring straight ahead, was the figure from the gas station. They weren't moving, they weren't breathing, but Chris could feel the weight of their presence, suffocating, freezing. He scrambled to open the door, but the locks wouldn't budge. "Let me out!" he screamed, yanking at the handle. The figure turned its head, slowly, unnaturally. Its face was pale, featureless except for 2 black holes where its eyes should have been. Chris's screams were drowned out by the sound of static filling the car. Then, everything went black. The next morning, a highway patrol officer found Chris's car abandoned on the side of the road. The driver's seat was empty, the gas tank full. To this day, no one knows what happened to him. But travelers who pass that stretch of highway late at night report strange things. Phantom cars parked on the shoulder, shadowy figures standing just outside the glow of their headlights. And some say if you stop at the right gas station, you might see a man standing there watching, waiting. Narrator, after a pause: would you have stopped at that station? Or would you have risked running out of gas? Let me know what you think in the comments. Jenna had been driving for hours on back roads. Her GPS had stopped working miles ago and her phone battery was dying fast. The road stretched ahead, empty and quiet, surrounded by dense woods on either side. When she saw the gas station, it felt like a relief. Its sign, glowing faintly in the distance, read Linden Gas. The place looked run down, an old two-pump station with a small convenience store. But it was the only sign of life she'd seen for miles. As Jenna pulled in, her car's headlights illuminated the pumps. One was covered in an out-of-order sign, leaving only Pump 2. She parked, stepped out, and grabbed the nozzle. But when she swiped her card, the screen flashed, "See attendant." Sighing, Jenna glanced toward the store. Through the grimy windows, she could make out a figure standing behind the counter. She walked in, the bell above the door jingling weakly. The air inside was stale, and the shelves were mostly empty, stocked with faded candy bars and dusty cans of soda. The attendant was an older man, wearing a worn uniform with the station's name stitched onto the chest. Linden Gas. His face was expressionless, his eyes locked on Jenna as she approached. "The pump says to see the attendant," Jenna said. The man nodded but didn't speak. Instead, he reached below the counter, pulled out an old leather-bound ledger and slid it toward her. "What's this?" Jenna asked, frowning. "You have to sign," the man said, his voice flat. "Sign for what?" "I just need gas." The man didn't respond. He just tapped the ledger. Reluctantly, Jenna picked up the pen attached to it. The pages were filled with names, written in shaky handwriting. Beside each name was a date. Some of them were from decades ago. The man stared at her, unblinking. Feeling uncomfortable, Jenna scrawled her name and pushed the book back. "Pump's ready," the man said, his voice as monotone as before. Jenna hurried back outside, her unease growing. She started pumping gas, glancing back at the store window. The man was still there watching her. His eyes didn't leave her, not even for a second. The pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. Jenna replaced the nozzle and climbed into her car, locking the doors out of habit. As she started the engine, she glanced at the store one last time. The man was gone, not just from the window, gone. The entire store was dark now, its lights out, its windows completely empty. Jenna's stomach twisted. She pulled out of the lot, her eyes darting between her mirrors and the road ahead. A few miles down, her headlights caught something on the side of the road, a faded sign. It read, "Linden Gas, next exit." Her heart pounded. That couldn't be right. She had just left Linden Gas. She drove faster, trying to shake the growing sense of dread. But a few minutes later, her phone buzzed. The screen lit up, displaying a single word: "Turn around." She dropped the phone onto the passenger seat, her breath quickening. Up ahead, she saw lights. Relief washed over her, another gas station. She pulled in, but as she parked, her blood ran cold. It was the same station, Linden Gas. Her car sputtered and died as soon as she stopped, the engine refusing to turn over. The store lights flickered on, and through the window she saw the attendant again. He was standing in the same spot, staring at her. But something was different this time. His face was no longer expressionless. He was smiling, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far. Jenna grabbed her phone, desperate to call for help, but the screen was blank, no signal, no battery, nothing. Then the door to the convenience store opened. The man didn't step out, but she heard his voice, clear and deliberate. "You shouldn't have signed." The next morning, a passerby found Jenna's car still parked at the station. The engine was cold and the tank was full. But Jenna was gone. Inside the store, the only trace of her was a single, freshly written name in the old leather ledger: Jenna Carson, 2024. Eric loved night drives. The stillness, the open road, the feeling of being completely alone, it all felt peaceful. But on this particular night, the peace felt off. He was driving through a remote area of the state, a route he'd never taken before. His fuel gauge was dangerously low and the nearest station was nowhere in sight. The highway was dead quiet, his headlights barely piercing the black void ahead. No cars, no signs, just an endless ribbon of asphalt. Finally, after what felt like forever, Eric spotted a dimly lit gas station tucked at the edge of the forest. Its neon sign buzzed faintly, flickering with the words, "Service Station." Relieved, Eric pulled in. The station was old, maybe abandoned, one flickering light above the pumps, a convenience store that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s, and an air of silence that felt oppressive. Eric parked next to the only working pump and grabbed the nozzle. He swiped his card. Error. Sea attendant. Of course, Eric muttered, rolling his eyes. He glanced toward the convenience store. The windows were dark, but the open sign flickered faintly in one corner. Reluctantly, he made his way inside. The bell above the door let out a weak jingle as Eric stepped into the store. It was empty, or so it seemed. The air was thick, musty, and carried a faint metallic tang. "Hello?" Eric called out, his voice echoing slightly. At first, there was no response. Then, from behind the counter, a man appeared. The attendant was strange-looking, his skin pale and waxy, his eyes slightly too wide. His uniform was neat but old-fashioned, like something from the 50s. "Pump's not working," Eric said, trying to ignore the unease creeping into his chest. The man nodded slowly. "Pump 2? "Yeah." The attendant didn't speak again. He just reached below the counter, pressed a button, and nodded toward the door. "Should be good now." Eric turned to leave, but as he reached the door, the attendant spoke again. "You shouldn't stay here too long." Eric froze, the hair on his neck standing up. He turned back to ask what the man meant, but the counter was empty. The attendant was gone. Shaking it off, Eric headed back to his car. The pump was working now, so he began filling the tank. That's when he noticed something. Across the lot, just beyond the edge of the light, was the forest. And standing at the tree line was something. Eric squinted, trying to make out the figure. It looked human, but it wasn't moving, just standing there, half hidden by the shadows of the trees. "Hey!" Eric called out, his voice cutting through the silence. "You need help!" No response. The pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. Eric replaced the nozzle and glanced back at the forest. The figure was closer now. It hadn't walked or run. It had just shifted, like a glitch in reality. Eric's pulse quickened. He jumped into his car, locking the doors. As he started the engine, his headlights illuminated the figure fully for the first time. It wasn't human. It had the shape of a man, but its limbs were too long, its posture slightly bent, and its head was wrong. No face, just smooth, featureless skin where its eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Eric slammed the car into reverse, his tires screeching as he sped out of the lot. He drove fast, the forest blurring past him, but no matter how far he went, the feeling of being watched didn't leave. His hands gripped the wheel tightly as he glanced in the rearview mirror. The road behind him was empty, or so he thought. A few minutes later, he saw something. In the distance, under the faint glow of the moonlight, he saw the gas station again. That wasn't possible. He'd driven miles. The station should have been far behind him. But there it was, the neon service station sign flickering in the darkness. "No way," Eric muttered, his voice trembling. He pulled over to the side of the road, his breathing shallow. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. Before he could figure out what to do next, his phone buzzed. Eric glanced at the screen. It was a text. "Come back." His blood ran cold. He didn't recognize the number. In fact, there was no number, just the message floating on his screen. Eric threw the phone onto the passenger seat and floored the gas pedal. For what felt like hours, he drove. He didn't care about directions anymore, he just needed to get away. But the gas station kept appearing, over and over. No matter how far he went, he kept finding himself back at the same place. Finally, with no other choice, Eric pulled into the lot again. The station looked exactly the same as it had before. The same pump, the same flickering light, the same dark forest pressing in on all sides. But this time, there was no attendant. The store windows were dark. The door hung open, swaying slightly in the breeze. Eric hesitated, then stepped out of his car. The air felt heavier now, almost suffocating. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaking. No answer. Slowly, he walked toward the store. The inside was pitch black, but something compelled him to keep going. As he stepped through the door, the smell of metal grew stronger. His foot bumped into something. He looked down and froze. It was the attendant's uniform, neatly folded, lying on the floor. Before he could react, a voice spoke from behind him. "You stayed too long." Eric spun around, but the store was empty. And then, from the forest, he heard the sound of branches snapping. Something was coming. The next morning, a truck driver found Eric's car abandoned at the gas station. The tank was full. The keys were in the ignition, but there was no sign of Eric. The driver later told police about the gas station, but when they went to investigate, they found nothing. No pumps, no store, just an empty lot surrounded by trees. And Eric? He was never seen again. Ryan had been driving since sunset, cutting through back roads to shave time off his trip. He was on his way home from a weekend with friends, and with every mile, the road grew darker, lonelier. The last thing he needed was car trouble. At first, it was just a sputter, a single cough from the engine. He ignored it. But a few miles later, the sound returned, louder this time, and the car began jerking slightly. "Great," Ryan muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. He glanced at the dashboard. The temperature gauge was climbing fast, and the check engine light blinked on. He let out a frustrated sigh. That's when he spotted the sign. Service station ahead. Relieved, Ryan slowed the car and pulled into a small gas station sitting on the edge of the woods. The place looked old, but the sign above the convenience store was brightly lit, reading, "Dale's Service." There was no one else around. No other cars, no traffic on the highway, just his sputtering engine and the faint hum of the station's fluorescent lights. Ryan parked by the pumps and stepped out, the cool night air wrapping around him. He popped the hood, peering at the engine like he knew what he was looking for. He didn't. After a few minutes of pretending he could fix the problem, he glanced toward the store. The windows were fogged, but he could make out a figure inside, sitting behind the counter. Maybe they knew someone who could help. Ryan walked toward the door, the bell above it jingling faintly as he stepped inside. The store was small and cluttered, the shelves lined with dusty snacks and faded bottles of soda. Behind the counter sat an older man with a weathered face and oil-streaked hands. He wore a grey jumpsuit with the name Dale stitched across the chest. "You need something?" the man asked, his voice low and gruff. "Yeah, my car's acting up. Do you know anyone who can take a look at it?" The man stared at him for a long moment before nodding. "I'm the mechanic." "Oh, great," Ryan said, relieved. "Can you check it out?" The man stood slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. "Sure, pull it around back." Ryan nodded, hurrying back to his car. He started the engine. It groaned in protest but managed to sputter to life and drove it around to the garage at the rear of the station. The garage was dimly lit, a single bulb swinging overhead. The mechanic was already there, waiting. Ryan climbed out, watching as the man opened the hood and leaned in, his movements slow and deliberate. "What do you think it is?" Ryan asked, trying to fill the silence. The mechanic didn't answer. Minutes passed, the sound of tools clinking and metal creaking filling the space. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. Something about the mechanic felt off. Finally, the man straightened up, wiping his hands again. Looks like a busted radiator. Ryan frowned. Can you fix it? The mechanic nodded. Might take a while. You can wait inside. Ryan hesitated. Something about the man's tone sent a chill down his spine, but he didn't have much of a choice. All right, he said, heading back toward the store. Inside, the air felt heavier than before. The fluorescent lights buzzed loudly, casting harsh shadows across the shelves. Ryan grabbed a soda from one of the coolers and sat at a small table by the window, staring out at the garage. The mechanic was still there, moving slowly, methodically. Ryan took a sip of his drink, but it tasted off, flat and metallic. He set it aside, his eyes drifting to the counter. There was an old register, a stack of yellowed receipts, and a photo frame. Curious, he walked over and picked up the frame. It held a black and white picture of a younger version of the mechanic, standing in front of the same station. Beside him was another man also wearing a jumpsuit. The strange part, the photo looked ancient, like it belonged in a museum. Yet the mechanic in the picture hadn't aged a day. A sudden noise made Ryan jump. It came from the garage, a loud metallic bang followed by the sound of something dragging across the floor. He rushed to the window but couldn't see much. The swinging bulb in the garage cast wild shadows, and for a moment Ryan thought he saw something moving, a shape, low and slinking like an animal, but it was gone just as quickly. Ryan's heart was racing now. He pulled out his phone, but there was no signal, no bars, just the faint glow of his lock screen. Another sound came from the garage, a low, guttural growl. Ryan backed away from the window, his breath quickening. He had to leave. He didn't care about the car anymore. He just needed to get out of there. He bolted for the door, but as he stepped outside, he froze. The mechanic was standing there, blocking his path. His face was blank, his hands still smeared with oil. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice low. "What? What do you mean?" Ryan stammered. The mechanic didn't answer. Instead, he stepped aside, gesturing toward the car. "It's ready." Ryan hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to run. But where would he go? The woods stretched endlessly on either side, and the road was empty for miles. Reluctantly, he walked toward the car. The hood was down, the engine idling smoothly. "Thanks," Ryan said, his voice shaking. He climbed into the driver's seat, keeping his eyes on the mechanic. As he pulled out of the garage, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The mechanic was gone. Ryan sped down the highway, his heart pounding. The station disappeared into the distance, and for a moment, he thought he was safe. But then the car sputtered again. "No, no, no," Ryan muttered, gripping the wheel. The engine groaned, the temperature gauge climbing once more. And then the car died. Ryan pulled to the shoulder, cursing under his breath. He glanced at the dashboard, hoping for some clue as to what had gone wrong. That's when he saw it. The odometer. It read the exact same mileage as when he'd stopped at the station. A chill ran down his spine. Slowly, he looked up, and there, in the rearview mirror, he saw the mechanic, standing in the middle of the road, staring at him. Ryan's hands shook as he tried to start the car, but the engine refused to turn over. When he looked back at the mirror, the mechanic was closer, and then the lights went out, narrator after a pause. Ryan's car was found the next morning, abandoned on the side of the road. The engine was cold, the keys still in the ignition. But Ryan was never seen again. Some say that gas station still appears to travelers, its neon sign glowing faintly in the distance. And if you stop there, you might meet the mechanic. But if you do, don't let him fix your car. If tonight's story gave you chills, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And tell me, what's the creepiest thing you've ever encountered on the road? I'd love to hear your stories. Stay safe out there.